I would like to thank the Nordic Circle of Ministers for the invitation to be in this panel on freedom of expression during the UNESCO event MONDIACULT 2022. Hearing the ministers of culture who just spoke before me, I felt compelled to introduce them to our own Minister of Culture in Cuba in the following video.
Oye, ¿qué pasó?
No hable más. ¿Por qué? Porque no me da la gana, no hable más. Pues ahí, vas a hablar, habla. ¡Habla! No hable más.
The Cuban regime representative, including at the UN, always say that they do not know that artists are in prison, nor about the repression of artists and citizens in Cuba by the state security forces. Their defense is that the activists are lying or paid by foreign agencies. What we just saw in this video was the arrival of artists to a pre-arranged meeting to talk with the Minister of Culture of Cuba. This only happened after around 500 artists and intellectuals stayed for a whole day and until really late at night in front of his office a few months earlier. We have been asking for years to have a meeting to talk about the repression to artists in Cuba, something the minister always denied existed. The area around the Ministry of Culture was surrounded by police and state security agents. The slap by the minister to take the phone from one of the artists, who is also a journalist, that was recording, was the gesture recognized by the police as the order to take the artist into detention. The sound we heard was a secret recording inside the bus when the artists are transported away from the ministry. The Ministry of Culture just looked at it. He did nothing to stop it. Now at least he can't deny violence against artists in Cuba exists. After this, artists and activists and civic society organized and requested his resignation by addressing the National Assembly petition system. Not only we are still waiting for an answer, but the minister was fiercely defended by the president. This is why I say yes to this invitation to speak here at this event titled Strengthening Cultural Policies to Promote Artistic Freedom. Because we have no place to go in Cuba to ask for our rights. Because I seek solidarity with the Cubans who are today in prison just for saying the word freedom in the streets, which is their constitutional right under the new constitution. We feel helpless. We have exhausted all legal and peaceful activist way to be heard with no response from the Cuban regime but violence and repression. I would have preferred not to be here. I want to be at my studio doing my artwork, but I cannot remain indifferent when my colleagues are in prison or as myself expelled from the country. Artists are supposed to reflect the time they are living in. For that in Cuba you can be in jail. How can we have culture when in 1 year more than 250,000 people flee the country because of fear? Cuba is living a culture of terror. How can we do art or have culture under these conditions? Is art even an option? The moderator asked us before what is needed in the global cultural policies to face these challenges. One can think of spaces like this one where to listen to direct testimony, but we need to find a way where regimes are not protected if their citizens are vulnerable. We need to stop the double censorship. For this, foreign cooperation agencies and organizations like UNESCO should not only work and support regimes-vetted artists and cultural projects sponsored by the state, but also support independent art projects and non-regime cultural spaces. Not giving access to those resources limits the opportunities for counter-narrative to exist, resulting in a monolithic idea of culture designed by regimes and not by the artists and the people. It puts artists that already are risking a lot in order to do an honest artwork or bring a different perspective on culture in an even more precarious situation. You are not protecting artists at risk nor defending freedom of expression if you are economically supporting solely regime-approved artists. Not supporting these independent projects educates younger artists into a model where the option is to stop defending their ideas on culture and politics, because the only result otherwise will be their isolation from everything and everywhere, increasing their fear to be reduced to nothing. When you solely collaborate with regimes, you become instruments of censorship. The solution to defending difference cannot be that everyone that thinks different becomes an exiled. For example, there is the International Fund for Cultural Diversity, IFCD. I encourage them to expand their support into independent artists and civic society, especially in countries like Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, where there is a decree like 349 limiting the independence of art and the 370 condemning people to unpayable fees or to go to prison for expressing their opinion or showing documentation of violation of human rights like the one I show you today. How can we produce freedom of expression if we don't have any support and protection neither from our regime nor from institutions like UNESCO? Independent artists and society cannot participate in any of the events sponsored by UNESCO in Cuba. To give you an example, my artwork is in the collection of the National Museum of Cuba, but I cannot enter the institution. Now imagine us trying to enter a UNESCO event in Cuba. Impossible. They won't even let us leave the house. How can we have culture if the access is not the same for everyone? And in an even more difficult situation are the independent journalists in Cuba. For example, El Toque, an independent journalist platform seen as moderate, had in the last 21 days 20 journalists leaving the project because of the pressure and threat of the state security police. How can we have culture if there is no alternative to state fake news and propaganda materials? Many of those journalists have recently graduated from the university. Today, the life at universities in Cuba is unacceptable. Students are expelled for signing letters of support for a colleague who has been unjustly separated from the study, or for writing things like socialism yes, repression no. So now, not even the people who are on the same ideological position of the regime can have a space to protest, to suggest, to whisper. It is a naturalized practice, the expulsion of professors for publishing a paper on an independent magazine or for asking a question in class, even for analyzing the new constitution in a law class. I invite you to visit the website Observatorio Libertad Académica, where they register violation of freedom of expression in academia in Cuba. In the meantime, a year ago, a high-ranking military with ties to the Secret Service in Cuba, quote-unquote dressed and quote-unquote vetted by the regime as a legitimate academic professor, is invited to an international academic congress to present, quote-unquote, the truth of what happens in Cuba. Who should be the expert for institutions like UNESCO? The person that creates and institutes censorship and violence, or the people who receive it? Who has the right to generate culture? Who has an authorized voice in places where the definition of present history is decided? There is an alarming tendency to authoritarianism in the world. None of the dictators, the autocrats, the censor want a record of their doing. Art is a way to uncover, to remember. The signs are there. You do not need to wait until someone is killed. Let's defend art made by the people instead of promoting the use of culture as political propaganda by regimes, because art survives any regime. They know it. We know it.